The faded neon sign of the Crescent Moon Motel buzzed faintly against the inky black sky. Situated on a lonely stretch of highway that seemed to go nowhere, the motel was a relic of a bygone era. Travelers rarely stopped anymore except when desperation struck. Clara and Ethan, a young couple on their way to a weekend getaway, found themselves stranded after their car mysteriously broke down miles from civilization. No cell phone signal, no passing cars, just the eerie quiet of the wilderness. When the motel came into view, it seemed like a strange beacon of salvation, albeit one that sent an unspoken chill through their spines. "Do we really have a choice?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible over the sigh of the wind. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the motel as if it were watching him back. "No," he said finally, "we don't." The lobby was just as unwelcoming as the motel's exterior, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb and smelling faintly of damp wood. The receptionist, a frail man with hollow eyes and a strained smile, greeted them with a nod. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he'd been waiting for them for a long time. "You'll be in room 13, he said after a long pause, sliding a rusted key across the counter. His gaze lingered on them for a beat too long. Before they could question him, he added with an unnerving smile, "Oh, and don't open the closet." Clara frowned. "What?" But the man was already turning away, retreating into the shadows behind the desk. Ethan shook his head, dismissing the strange warning as an eccentric quirk of the old motel. "Let's just get some rest." Room 13 was everything they expected and worse. The walls were paper thin, the wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips. The bed creaked under the slightest touch, and the stale scent of mildew clung to everything. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the room itself didn't want them there. Clara tried to laugh it off. "Well, it's cozy." Ethan forced a smile. "It's one night. We'll figure out the car in the morning." Hours passed uneventfully, and exhaustion finally claimed them. But, as the clock struck midnight, a sound broke the oppressive silence, a faint scratching, coming from inside the closet. Clara stirred, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" Ethan groaned, half asleep. "It's just mice or something. Go back to bed." The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across wood. Clara sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The closet door stood across the room, slightly ajar. She could have sworn it had been closed when they came in. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The door. Look." Ethan opened his eyes. Following her gaze, he froze. The door creaked, moving slightly, as though someone or something was inside. "Stay here," Ethan said, sliding out of bed. He grabbed the motel's flimsy bedside lamp as a makeshift weapon and approached the closet. Each step felt heavier than the last. Clara watched, clutching the sheets to her chest. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by unnatural stillness. Ethan hesitated, then threw the door open. The closet was empty. Nothing but shadows and an overwhelming sense of wrongness greeted him. He exhaled sharply, his muscles relaxing. "See, nothing." A deafening slam cut him off. The closet door swung shut with a force that shook the walls. Clara screamed, and Ethan stumbled back, dropping the lamp. The room fell silent again, but the air buzzed with an invisible tension. "Let's get out of here," Clara said, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, his face pale. They hurriedly packed their things and made their way to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock turned, the knob twisted, but the door remained stubbornly in place. "It's stuck," Ethan muttered, his voice tinged with panic. Behind them, the closet door creaked open once more. Clara turned slowly, her stomach sinking. A figure stood in the shadows, barely visible but undeniably there. Its outline was distorted, shifting unnaturally, like something trying to take human form but failing. "Who are you?" Clara managed to choke out. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It only stared. Door seemed to. The sense of being watched was suffocating, oppressive, and then it lunged. Clara screamed as the shadowy figure surged forward, its form flickering like a broken projection. Ethan grabbed her arm and pulled her back, slamming his shoulder against the door with all his strength. The figure stopped inches from them, hovering at the edge of the dim light, its features still impossible to make out. It was as though the thing didn't belong entirely to this world, slipping in and out of reality. Ethan twisted the doorknob violently. "Come on, open," he growled. The door groaned under his weight, but it held firm, as if the room itself refused to let them go. The figure stepped closer. As it moved into the faint glow of the bedside lamp, its shape became clear, horrifyingly so. It resembled a person, but the proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its skin seemed to ripple as if something beneath it was alive. Clara whimpered, gripping Ethan's arm. "Do something," she cried. The creature let out a guttural hiss, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. It raised one distorted hand and pointed toward the closet. The closet door creaked wider, revealing an impenetrable darkness within. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a void, consuming any light that dared to reach it. Ethan grabbed the bedside lamp and hurled it at the figure. The lamp shattered against the wall, sparks flying, but the creature didn't flinch. It remained motionless, its gaze or whatever passed for it fixed on them. "Back up," Ethan shouted, dragging Clara with him. They retreated to the far corner of the room, the bed between them and the creature. The darkness from the closet seemed to spill into the room, stretching toward them like inky tendrils. "What is that thing?" Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice tight with fear. "But we need to get out of here." The creature hissed again, louder this time, and the air in the room grew heavier. It felt as though invisible hands were pressing down on their chests, making it harder to breathe. The walls groaned, the ceiling creaked, and the floor beneath them vibrated faintly. The room itself seemed to be alive, reacting to the presence of the creature. Clara glanced toward the window. It was their only other escape. The window. "Maybe we can break it." Ethan nodded and grabbed one of the motel's flimsy chairs. He swung it at the window with all his strength, but instead of shattering, the glass absorbed the impact like it was made of rubber. The chair bounced back, and Ethan stumbled, nearly falling. "It's no use," he muttered. "This whole place is a trap." The figure began to move again, its jerky, unnatural steps closing the distance between them. Clara clutched Ethan's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "What does it want?" As if in response to her question, the creature stopped abruptly and pointed again toward the closet. This time, its voice emerged a low, guttural whisper that sounded like a dozen voices speaking at once. "Come ... inside." Clara shook her head violently. No way." Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What's in there? What's in the closet?" The creature tilted its head, its movements eerily slow. It didn't answer, but instead began to dissolve into the shadows, merging with the creeping darkness that emanated from the closet. Within moments, it was gone, leaving only an oppressive silence in its wake. The closet door stood wide open now, revealing nothing but blackness. The room felt colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that their breath became visible in the air. Ethan and Clara stood frozen, unsure of what to do. "We can't stay here," Ethan finally said. "We have to." A deep, resonating voice interrupted him, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have entered the threshold. The choice has been made." "What choice?" Clara cried. "We didn't choose anything." The voice didn't answer, but the closet began to change. The darkness inside it seemed to ripple, and faint whispers emerged, soft at first, then growing louder, overlapping until they became an unbearable cacophony. Ethan grabbed Clara's hand. "We need to make a run for it." "But the door." "Then we fight," Ethan said, his jaw tight. "Whatever this is, we're not just going to sit here and let it take us." Clara hesitated, her eyes darting between Ethan and the closet. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. She could hear fragments of words now please, screams, and something else, laughter. Suddenly, a powerful force pulled at them, dragging them toward the closet. Clara screamed, digging her heels into the carpet, but it was no use. The darkness had become tangible, gripping them like invisible hands. Ethan fought against the pull, grabbing onto the bed frame with one hand and holding Clara's wrist with the other. "Hold on," he shouted ... but the force was too strong. The last thing Clara saw before the darkness consumed them was the room distorting, the walls bending and twisting as if the motel was swallowing them whole. Then, everything went black. When Clara opened her eyes, she found herself lying on a cold, hard surface. The air was damp and heavy, carrying an acrid metallic scent that made her stomach churn. She sat up slowly, her head pounding as if she'd been struck. Around her, the world was cloaked in shadow, with only faint, pulsing red light illuminating the space in irregular intervals. "Ethan," she called, her voice trembling and echoing unnaturally. A groan came from somewhere to her left. Turning quickly, Clara saw Ethan sprawled on the ground, his body barely visible in the dim light. She crawled toward him, her hands scraping against a gritty, uneven floor. "Ethan, wake up," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, and he winced as he tried to sit up. "Where are we?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," Clara replied, glancing around. The space felt endless yet claustrophobic, the air thick and oppressive. The red light pulsed again, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Ethan pushed himself up, leaning heavily against Clara. "The closet," he muttered, as if piecing things together. "It pulled us in." Clara nodded, her throat tightening. "But where is this?" "It's not the motel anymore." The sound of distant whispers returned, faint but growing steadily louder. The words were fragmented and distorted, like voices coming from a broken radio. Clara and Ethan instinctively clung to each other, their eyes darting toward the direction of the sound. "We need to find a way out," Ethan said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. He scanned the dim expanse around them, searching for anything resembling an exit. All he could see were towering, jagged structures that seemed to shift and shimmer like heat waves. Clara grabbed his arm. "Do you hear that?" The whispers had grown clearer. They weren't just random sounds anymore, they were words. "Turn back," one voice murmured. "You shouldn't be here," said another. Others joined in, overlapping in a chilling chorus. "What is this place?" Clara whispered, her nails digging into Ethan's arm. Before he could answer, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. They fell to their knees, clutching each other as the floor cracked and split. From the fissures, black tendrils emerged, writhing and twisting like living shadows. The tendrils seemed to sense their presence, reaching toward them with eerie purpose. "Run," Ethan shouted, pulling Clara to her feet. They stumbled forward, away from the tendrils, but the space seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The whispers grew louder, the words more urgent, but now they carried an edge of malice. "You can't escape," one voice hissed. "It's too late," said another. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as they ran. "Where are we going?" "There's no way out. There has to be." Ethan yelled back, though his own voice carried a note of desperation. The red light pulsed again, revealing a towering archway in the distance. It was carved from black stone, its surface etched with incomprehensible symbols that seemed to writhe and shimmer when looked at directly. Beyond the archway was an even deeper darkness, but it was their only option. "There," Ethan pointed. "That's got to lead somewhere." Clara hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay away from the archway, but the tendrils were closing in fast. With no other choice, she followed Ethan, their footsteps echoing eerily in the vast space. As they neared the archway, a deafening roar shook the air, and a figure emerged from the shadows behind them. It was the same distorted creature from the motel, but now its form was even more grotesque. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, and its face was a void of shifting blackness, with two glowing red eyes piercing through the darkness. "Go," Ethan shouted, pushing Clara toward the archway. He turned to face the creature, grabbing a loose shard of jagged stone from the ground. "What are you doing?" Clara screamed, grabbing his arm. "I'll hold it off, just go," Ethan insisted, shoving her again. Clara's heart wrenched, but the creature was closing in fast. The tendrils were nearly at their heels. She turned and sprinted toward the archway, tears streaming down her face as Ethan's voice rang out behind her. The moment Clara passed through the archway, everything changed. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow even more terrifying. She found herself in a narrow corridor, its walls pulsing faintly with the same red light. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath and staring back at the archway. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. The archway shimmered, and for a moment, she thought she saw Ethan's silhouette running toward her. But before he could reach the threshold, the creature's shadow engulfed him, and the archway slammed shut with a resounding boom. Clara screamed, pounding her fists against the unyielding stone. "No, Ethan!" The corridor trembled, and a deep voice echoed around her. "The choice has been made." Clara turned, her body trembling with fear and grief. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, its faint pulsing light guiding her forward. She had no choice but to move. Behind her, the faint whispers began to rise again, softer this time, but unmistakable. "Keep going," they said. "There's no turning back." Clara staggered through the pulsing corridor, her legs trembling and her mind reeling with grief. Ethan was gone, swallowed by the creature and the shadows of the motel's curse. Every step forward felt heavier, as though the air itself resisted her. The faint red glow that lined the walls flickered erratically, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to move on their own. Her breathing was ragged, her thoughts a chaotic whirl. "Why us? Why Ethan? What does this place want?" The corridor narrowed as she moved forward, forcing her to press against the cold, pulsing walls. The fleshy texture beneath her palms made her stomach churn, but there was no turning back. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, repeating the same phrases over and over. "Keep going. Face the truth. There's no escape." Suddenly, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was enormous, its ceiling lost in darkness. The floor glistened with a strange, black liquid that reflected the faint red light emanating from grotesque symbols carved into the walls. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it lay an old, tattered book bound in cracked leather. Clara hesitated. The room felt alive, its oppressive energy pressing down on her like a physical weight. The whispers had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to amplify the sound of her own heartbeat. She took a tentative step forward. The black liquid rippled under her foot, as though it were alive. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to move closer to the pedestal. The book seemed to call to her, a silent, irresistible pull. As she reached the pedestal, she noticed faint inscriptions glowing faintly on its surface. The language was unfamiliar, the symbols twisting and shifting as she tried to focus on them. Despite her fear, she felt compelled to touch the book. Her fingers brushed against the rough leather, and the room instantly came alive. The symbols on the walls flared with brilliant crimson light, and the black liquid beneath her began to churn violently. Clara stumbled back, clutching her ears as a deafening roar filled the chamber. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent now. "Read it. Only then will you see. Only then will you know." "No!" Clara screamed, shaking her head. "I don't want to know." But the pull of the book was relentless. Her hands moved on their own, reaching for the cover and flipping it open. The pages were filled with the same strange symbols, yet as she stared at them, they began to shift and morph into words she could understand. The first line sent a chill through her entire body. "To those who enter room 13, the past must be faced, and the truth must be paid in full." Clara's hands trembled as she continued reading. The book told of a place cursed long ago, a nexus between worlds, where lost souls were drawn to face the consequences of their darkest choices. Room 13 was not a room at all, but a gateway to this accursed dimension. Those who entered it became part of its endless cycle, their fates determined by the secrets they carried. Her mind reeled as she read further. The book described countless others who had entered room 13 before her. Some were devoured by the shadows, others were consumed by the horrors of their own past, and a very few, had survived, but at great cost. The choice was made the moment you stepped through the door, the book concluded. To leave, one must give that which is most precious. No, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. This can't be real. The room rumbled violently, and a familiar voice echoed through the chamber. Clara, her breath caught. Ethan. She spun around, her heart leaping with a desperate hope. Ethan stood at the edge of the chamber, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. His clothes were torn, and dark tendrils snaked around his arms and legs, pulling him back toward the shadows. "Help me," he pleaded, his voice raw and broken. "Clara, please." She ran toward him, but the black liquid surged up, forming a barrier between them. The tendrils tightened around Ethan, dragging him closer to the darkness. Clara screamed, reaching out desperately. "I'll save you," she cried. "Hold on." Ethan's face twisted in anguish. "You can't. You have to go. It wants you, Clara. It's always wanted you." "What are you talking about?" she yelled, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not leaving you." The shadows behind Ethan shifted, and the creature emerged once more, its distorted form towering over him. Its red eyes glowed with malice as it reached for Ethan, pulling him into its dark embrace. "No!" Clara screamed, pounding her fists against the barrier of black liquid. "Take me instead. Please, take me." The creature froze, its glowing eyes fixing on Clara. The room fell silent, the only sound the rapid pounding of her heart. Slowly, the barrier dissolved, and the creature extended one long, twisted arm toward her. "The choice has been made," it hissed, its voice a chilling blend of whispers and growls. Clara stepped forward, her body trembling but her resolve firm. If giving herself to the darkness could save Ethan, it was a price she was willing to pay. She reached for the creature's outstretched hand, her fingers brushing against its cold, shadowy form. As soon as she made contact, a surge of pain shot through her, and the world around her dissolved into darkness. The last thing she heard was Ethan's voice, screaming her name. Then, silence. Clara awoke in a suffocating silence. The air was heavy, almost impossible to breathe, and the darkness around her felt infinite, pressing against her skin like a living thing. She tried to move, but her limbs felt sluggish, as though submerged in thick, invisible tar. Her first thought was of Ethan. "Ethan," she called, her voice barely more than a whisper in the oppressive void. It echoed faintly, as though the darkness absorbed most of the sound, giving it back in fragments. No response. She tried again, louder this time. "Ethan, where are you?" Her voice triggered something in the shadows. The darkness began to stir, rippling and shifting like ink in water. Slowly, faint shapes began to emerge, indistinct at first, then sharpening into recognizable forms. Clara found herself standing in a room that looked disturbingly familiar. It was room 13, the same peeling wallpaper, the same creaking bed. The closet, now closed, loomed larger than before, as though it had grown in the time she was gone. The oppressive silence remained, broken only by the faint hum of something she couldn't identify. She stumbled forward, clutching her aching head. The room felt wrong, as if it were watching her. Her hand brushed against the bed frame, and she recoiled. The surface was damp and sticky, leaving a dark stain on her palm. Panic surged in her chest as she wiped her hand on her clothes, trying to rid herself of the sensation. "Why am I back here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The faint hum grew louder, and Clara's eyes darted to the closet. The door was vibrating slightly, as though something inside was struggling to get out. She backed away instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. A voice echoed through the room, low and guttural. "You cannot leave until the truth is faced." Clara spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but she was alone. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the closet door creaked open an inch, revealing a sliver of impenetrable darkness. A cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it a faint whisper. "Look inside." Clara shook her head, her body trembling. "No, I'm not going near that thing." The door creaked open wider, and the whisper grew louder. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was a chorus, overlapping and chaotic, speaking words she couldn't fully understand. Her back hit the far wall as she tried to put as much distance as possible between herself and the closet. Her breathing quickened, her pulse racing. Then, she heard it, Clara. Her name, spoken in Ethan's voice, emerged from the darkness of the closet. She froze, her fear clashing with a surge of hope. "Ethan," she called, her voice breaking. "Is that you? Help me," the voice said, faint and distorted but unmistakably his. Clara's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move. Her feet dragged across the floor as she approached the closet. The whispers intensified, growing louder with every step, until they were a deafening roar in her ears. She clapped her hands over them, but it didn't help. "Ethan," she screamed, reaching the closet. She peered into the darkness, her hands trembling as she gripped the door frame. The inside of the closet wasn't empty, it was a swirling vortex of shadows, an abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. Shapes moved within it, indistinct and writhing, like souls trapped in endless torment. "Clara," Ethan's voice came again, more desperate this time. "Please." Tears streamed down her face. "I'm here. Tell me where you are." Suddenly, something reached out of the darkness, a hand. It was Ethan's hand, pale and trembling, grasping for her. Without thinking, Clara lunged forward, grabbing his wrist. "I've got you," she cried, pulling with all her strength. The shadows resisted, tugging back, trying to drag her into the abyss along with him. "Don't let go," Ethan screamed, his face emerging from the vortex. His eyes were wide with terror, his features distorted by the swirling darkness around him. "I won't," Clara yelled, her grip tightening. The room began to shake violently, the walls cracked, and the floor buckled beneath her feet. The whispers turned into anguished screams, a cacophony of rage and despair. The vortex pulsed, its tendrils reaching out to wrap around Clara's arms, pulling her closer. Her strength was fading, the shadows were too strong. "Clara," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "You have to let me go." "No," she sobbed. "I won't lose you. If you don't, it'll take us both," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Please, you have to live." "I can't," as she started, but her words were cut off as the shadows surged around them, pulling harder. "Promise me," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "Promise me you'll fight." Clara shook her head, her heart breaking. "I can't leave you. Promise me." The tendrils tightened their grip, and Clara knew she had no choice. Her fingers trembled as she loosened her hold on his wrist. Tears blurred her vision as she let go, watching as Ethan was pulled back into the darkness. The vortex collapsed with a deafening roar, and Clara was thrown backward. She hit the floor hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. The room fell silent once more. When she opened her eyes, the closet was closed, and the room was empty. Ethan was gone. Clara lay there, tears streaming down her face, the weight of her loss crushing her. But deep down, she knew she couldn't stay here. Ethan had made her promise to fight, and she intended to keep that promise. Clara lay on the floor of room 13, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum that seemed to pulse through the walls. The weight of what had just happened crushed her chest. Ethan was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and she had let him go. But his final words echoed in her mind, an anchor to cling to in the midst of her despair. "Promise me you'll fight." Wiping the tears from her face, Clara forced herself to sit up. The room was eerily still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for her next move. The closet door remained closed now, but it loomed like a threat, its presence impossible to ignore. She stood shakily, every muscle in her body protesting. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door to the room, testing the knob again. To her surprise, it turned easily this time. Clara hesitated, glancing back at the closet one last time before stepping into the hallway. The corridor beyond was different now. It no longer resembled the dim, decrepit halls of the Crescent Moon Motel. Instead, it was impossibly long, stretching into an infinite expanse of shadow. The walls were smooth and cold, pulsating faintly with an otherworldly red glow. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on her shoulders. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice swallowed by the void. The hallway seemed to respond. Faint whispers began to rise from the shadows, indistinct at first, but growing louder as she walked. Clara's footsteps echoed unnaturally, each step accompanied by a strange distortion in the air. The whispers weren't just noise, they were words, fragments of sentences that sent chills down her spine. "Turn back, you don't belong here. Keep moving, the truth awaits. Face it, or be consumed." Clara shook her head, trying to block out the voices, but they seemed to seep into her mind, twisting her thoughts. She quickened her pace, desperate to escape the suffocating hallway. The faint red glow grew brighter ahead, drawing her toward what appeared to be an opening. She stepped into a new chamber, her breath catching at the sight before her. The room was massive, its floor covered in the same dark, reflective liquid she had seen earlier. In the center of the chamber stood a large circular platform, surrounded by 6 tall, black obelisks. The air hummed with a low vibration, and the obelisks glowed faintly with crimson light, casting shifting shadows across the walls. Clara's instinct screamed at her to turn back, but there was no other way. She stepped cautiously onto the platform, the black liquid rippling beneath her feet as if alive. The moment she reached the center, the humming grew louder, and the obelisks flared with light. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the chamber. It wasn't the chaotic whispers she had heard before. This voice was singular, commanding, and filled with an unnatural authority. "You have entered the trial." Clara froze, her heart pounding. "What trial? What do you want from me?" The voice ignored her question. "To escape, you must face the truth. To face the truth, you must confront the shadows of your past." "What are you talking about?" Clara demanded, her voice rising in panic. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just want to leave." The obelisks flared brighter, and the dark liquid around the platform began to rise, forming towering shapes. Clara stumbled back as the shapes took on human-like forms, their features grotesque and distorted. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking and twisting as they surrounded her. "These are the echoes of your past," the voice intoned. "Only by confronting them can you break free." Clara shook her head, fear gripping her chest. "No, I don't understand." One of the figures stepped forward, its shadowy face morphing and shifting. Slowly, it solidified into a form Clara recognized, a woman with a stern expression, her eyes cold and judgmental. "Mom," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The figure's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You always were a disappointment, Clara, running away from your problems, just like you always do." "No," Clara said, shaking her head. "You're not real." Another figure emerged, this one taking the shape of a young man with an accusing glare. "You left me, Clara," he said, his voice filled with venom. "You promised you'd be there, but you abandoned me when I needed you most." Clara's stomach churned as the memories flooded back. She knew who he was, a friend she had failed to help in her darkest hour. Tears welled in her eyes as she backed away, but the figures pressed closer, their voices growing louder. "You're weak, Clara. You've always been weak. People suffer because of you. You can't save anyone. Even Ethan is gone because of you." "Stop," Clara screamed, clutching her ears. The voices were deafening, their accusations slicing through her like knives. The figures circled her, their distorted faces twisting into cruel mockeries of the people she had known and loved. The deep voice returned, booming above the chaos. "Do you deny the truth?" Clara dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I tried so hard. The chamber trembled, the shadows surging closer. Clara's mind was a whirlwind of guilt and pain, the weight of her regrets threatening to crush her completely. But Ethan's voice echoed in her mind, cutting through the noise. "Promise me you'll fight." With a surge of determination, Clara stood, her hands clenched into fists. "No," she shouted. "I'm not perfect, and I've made mistakes, but I'm not going to let this place take me. Not like this." The shadows recoiled slightly, the figures faltering. The obelisks dimmed, their glow flickering. "I'm not running anymore," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "If I have to face my past, then so be it, but I'm not giving up." The chamber fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting slightly. The shadows dissolved, retreating into the black liquid, and the obelisks dimmed completely. Clara stood alone on the platform, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. The deep voice spoke again, softer this time. "You have begun to understand. The path forward lies in acceptance." Clara exhaled shakily, her body trembling from the ordeal. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The platform beneath her began to shift, and a new doorway appeared at the far end of the chamber, glowing faintly with a golden light. "Step forward," the voice said. "The trial is not yet over." Clara hesitated, glancing back at the empty chamber. Then, with a deep breath, she walked toward the doorway, her steps steady and purposeful. The light swallowed her as she crossed the threshold, leaving the chamber behind. Clara emerged from the glowing doorway into a space unlike any she had seen before. The oppressive shadows and crimson light of the previous chambers were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of white. The ground beneath her feet felt solid, yet she couldn't see it. It was as if she were standing on air. The only discernible feature was a solitary figure standing several feet ahead, facing away from her. The figure was familiar, and Clara's breath hitched in her throat. "Ethan," she called hesitantly, her voice echoing in the vast emptiness. The figure didn't move. Clara took a cautious step forward. "Ethan, is that you?" As she approached, the figure began to turn, slowly revealing a face that sent a chill through her entire body. It was Ethan, but something was wrong. His features were twisted with pain, his eyes hollow and dark, and his skin looked ashen, almost lifeless. "You left me," he said, his voice low and strained. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "No, I didn't," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I tried to save you. You let go." Ethan continued, his voice growing louder. "You promised me, Clara. You promised to fight. But you gave up." Clara shook her head violently, backing away. "No, that's not true. I didn't have a choice." Ethan's expression darkened, his form shifting and flickering like a projection. "You always say that. No choice, no control. It's always someone else's fault." The words stung, cutting deeper than the accusations of the shadows in the trial chamber. Clara's tears spilled over, her hands trembling at her sides. "I did what I could. I couldn't save everyone." Ethan stepped closer, his movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. "But you didn't even try to save yourself." Clara froze, her breath catching. The words echoed in her mind, striking a chord of truth that she didn't want to confront. Her whole life, she had carried the weight of guilt and failure, letting it define her. She had pushed people away, avoided responsibilities, and numbed herself to the pain of her choices. "You've let the past consume you," Ethan said, his voice softer now but no less piercing. "That's why you're here." The world around them began to shift, the white void dissolving into a series of fragmented images. Clara gasped as she saw flashes of her life, the moments she had tried so hard to forget. She saw herself as a child, standing outside her parents' bedroom as they argued. Her mother's harsh words echoed in her mind. "You'll never be good enough, Clara." She saw herself in college, walking away from a friend in need because she couldn't face their pain. She saw Ethan lying in the darkness of the motel, his hand slipping from hers as she let go. The memories overwhelmed her, each one a reminder of her failures, her fears, and her regrets. She fell to her knees, clutching her head as the voices of her past swirled around her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The images stopped abruptly, the world around her returning to the blank void. Ethan stood before her again, his face no longer twisted with anger but filled with sadness. "You can't change the past," he said gently, "but you can decide what to do next." Clara looked up at him, her tears blurring her vision. "What do I do? How do I make this right?" Ethan reached out, his hand hovering in front of her. "You let go of the guilt, you forgive yourself, and you fight for the future." For yourself? Clara hesitated, her heart pounding. The fear and pain she had carried for so long felt like an unmovable weight, but Ethan's words stirred something inside her. A flicker of hope, a spark of strength. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his. The moment they touched, a wave of warmth surged through her, washing away the cold and heaviness that had consumed her. The void around them began to glow with the golden light, and Ethan's form grew brighter, his features softening into a peaceful smile. "Clara," he said, his voice steady and strong. "This is your fight now. I'll always be with you." The light grew blinding, and Clara closed her eyes against its intensity. When she opened them again, Ethan was gone, and she was standing in a new space of forest bathed in soft, golden sunlight. The air was warm and filled with the sound of birdsong, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness she had endured. Clara took a deep breath, her chest no longer weighed down by the suffocating pressure she had felt for so long. She still felt the ache of loss, but it was accompanied by a newfound clarity. She had faced the shadows of her past, and while the scars remained, they no longer defined her. Ahead of her, a narrow path wound through the trees, leading toward an unseen destination. Clara squared her shoulders, her steps steady and purposeful as she began to walk forward. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't running away. She was moving toward something, toward a future she was ready to face. Clara walked down the sunlit path, the warmth of the golden light washing over her like a balm for her soul. The oppressive fear and darkness that had haunted her felt distant now, like the remnants of a nightmare she was finally beginning to escape. The path ahead was lined with tall, ancient trees whose leaves shimmered like gold, their branches swaying gently in an unseen breeze. As she moved forward, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't entirely free yet. While the forest felt serene, there was an undercurrent of something watching. She glanced over her shoulder occasionally, her instincts urging her to stay alert. The whispers began again, not harsh like before, but faint, almost curious. "You've come so far. Will you see it through?" The voices seemed neither malevolent nor kind. They simply existed, as though they were part of the forest itself. Clara clenched her fists and kept walking. She wasn't going to let herself be paralyzed by fear again. The path led to a clearing, and Clara froze when she saw what lay in the center. A large mirror stood tall and imposing, its frame made of twisted, blackened wood. The reflective surface shimmered unnaturally, as though it were alive. Around the base of the mirror were scattered fragments of broken glass, glinting like tiny shards of stars in the sunlight. Clara's heart sank. She knew instinctively that this was the next trial. The mirror's surface rippled, and an image began to form. It was her reflection, or at least it seemed like it at first. The figure in the mirror was Clara, but different. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes torn, and her face bore a cruel, mocking smirk. "Look at you," the reflection said, its voice dripping with disdain. "So desperate to believe you're brave, that you've changed, but you haven't." Clara stepped closer, her jaw tightening. "I'm not afraid of you." The reflection laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that sent chills down Clara's spine. "You should be. I'm everything you've buried, everything you hate about yourself. And I'll never go away." Clara's hands trembled, but she forced herself to hold the reflection's gaze. "I know what you are. You're my guilt, my fear, my doubt. You've been controlling me for years, and I'm done letting you win. The reflection smirk faltered for a moment, but it quickly returned, sharper than before. You think a few pretty words will change anything. You're weak. You always have been. You let Ethan die. You ran away from everyone who needed you. You'll do it again. Clara's chest tightened, the reflection's words striking at the rawest parts of her soul. But this time, instead of retreating into herself, she took a deep breath and stepped closer to the mirror. You're right, she said, her voice steady. I've made mistakes. I've hurt people. And I've been running from that for too long. But I'm not running anymore. The reflection smirk twisted into a snarl. You can't get rid of me. I'm you, Clara nodded. You are, but you're not all of me. You're the part that kept me stuck in the past. And I'm done letting you control me. The mirror began to tremble, cracked spider webbing across its surface. The reflection's expression contorted with fury, its voice rising into a distorted scream. You can't escape me. You'll never be free. Clara raised her hand and pressed it against the mirror. The cold surface burned her palm, but she didn't pull away. I'm not trying to escape, she said softly. I'm facing you. I'm facing myself. The mirror shattered, the sound echoing through the clearing like a thunderclap. Clara stumbled back as the shards exploded outward, dissolving into golden dust before they could reach her. The frame of the mirror crumbled, collapsing into a heap of ash at her feet. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a gentle breeze swept through the clearing, carrying away the remnants of the mirror. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. Clara exhaled shakily, her body trembling from the effort. She sank to her knees, staring at the empty space where the mirror had stood. The reflection's words still lingered in her mind, but they no longer had the same power over her. She had faced the darkest parts of herself, and while the scars would remain, she felt lighter. The whispers returned, but this time, they were softer, almost soothing. You are stronger than you know. You are closer than you think. Clara stood, wiping the tears from her face. The path beyond the clearing had reappeared, winding deeper into the forest. She didn't know where it led, but for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She took a step forward, and the forest seemed to welcome her. The golden light grew brighter, and the whispers faded into a gentle hum. Clara walked with purpose, her heart steady and her resolve firm. The trials weren't over, but she was ready. The golden light of the forest grew softer as Clara continued along the path, wrapping her in a cocoon of calm. The air carried a faint warmth, but beneath it lingered a strange tension. Each step felt heavier, as if the path was testing her resolve. Still, she pressed on, determined to finish what she had started. The trees began too thin, their golden leaves fading into shades of deep crimson and black. The path ahead curved into a wide, open field, but something about it made Clara stop in her tracks. The grass was brittle, almost ash-like, and the air hummed with an unnatural vibration that made her skin crawl. In the center of the field stood a single structure, a large wooden door, unsupported by any walls. Its surface was scarred and splintered, with dark, jagged carvings etched into the wood. The carvings resembled symbols she had seen in the earlier chambers, twisting and writhing as if alive. Clara approached cautiously, her breath hitching as she noticed what was written across the top of the door in stark, blood-red letters, the final choice. Her pulse quickened. She had no idea what lay beyond the door, but something deep inside her whispered that this was the end, or the beginning. Either way, there was no turning back. As she reached for the handle, the whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices layered and urgent. Step through, and the truth will be revealed. Only the worthy may pass. Everything comes at a price. Clara hesitated, her hand trembling. What truth? What price? She whispered, but the whispers didn't answer. They only repeated their cryptic warnings, their urgency growing. Swallowing her fear, Clara gripped the handle and pulled the door open. The moment it swung wide, a blinding white light spilled out, consuming the field and the forest behind her. She shielded her eyes, but the light pulled her in, weightless and overwhelming. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no air, no sense of time. When the light faded, Clara found herself standing in a room that was both familiar and alien. It resembled room 13 from the motel, but it was pristine now, its walls unblemished and glowing faintly with a warm light. In the center of the room stood a small wooden table, and on it rested a black box with intricate gold detailing. She approached the table cautiously. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The box radiated an almost magnetic energy, drawing her closer. A voice calm and commanding spoke from the stillness. "This is the final test." Clara flinched, spinning around, but the room was empty. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What is this place?" The voice ignored her question. "Inside the box lies the key to your freedom." "But freedom demands sacrifice." Her heart raced as she turned back to the box. The carvings on its surface shimmered faintly, and the air around it seemed to ripple. "What kind of sacrifice?" she asked, her voice shaking. The voice replied, steady and unyielding. "That which you value most. The choice is yours." Clara stared at the box, her mind racing. She thought of Ethan, of the trials she had endured, of the guilt and fear that had haunted her for so long. What did she value most, and was she willing to lose it? She reached for the box, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. The moment she touched it, the room dissolved around her, and she was transported into a swirling void of memories. She saw herself as a child, standing outside her parents' bedroom, listening to their arguments. She saw Ethan, his face filled with pain as he reached for her in the vortex. She saw herself staring into the mirror, confronting the darkest parts of her soul. Each memory was a fragment of her journey, a piece of the puzzle that had brought her to this moment. The voice spoke again, softer now. "To be free, you must choose. What are you willing to let go of to move forward?" Clara clenched her fists, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what you want from me," she screamed into the void. "I've already lost so much. I've faced everything you've thrown at me. What more do you want?" The void pulsed, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Ethan, his face calm and serene, his eyes filled with understanding. "You know the answer, Clara," he said gently. "It's not about what they want. It's about what you need to let go of." Clara stared at him, her heart breaking all over again. She thought of the guilt she had carried for years, the fear that had held her back, the memories she had clung to like anchors. She thought of Ethan, the person she had loved most, and the promise she had made to him. Slowly, she turned back to the box. "I understand," she whispered. "It's time to let go." She opened the box, her hands steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Inside was a single, glowing orb of light, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. She reached for it, feeling its warmth as it rested in her hands. As she held the orb, the voice spoke one final time. "You have chosen to release the past. The path forward is now yours." The orb dissolved into light, enveloping Clara in a warmth that spread through her entire being. The void dissolved, and she found herself standing in the forest once again, the golden light brighter than ever. Clara took a deep breath, her chest lighter than it had been in years. She knew the trials were over. She had faced her past, her fears, and her guilt. And now, for the first time in her life, she was free. Ahead of her, the path stretched into the horizon, bathed in golden light. With steady steps, Clara began to walk, leaving room 13 and everything it had taken from her far behind. The golden path wound through the forest, the air alive with warmth and light. Clara walked with a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. Every step felt purposeful, as though the weight she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. The whispers were gone, the shadows dissolved, and for the first time, silence felt comforting rather than oppressive. She didn't know where the path led, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't running anymore. As she walked, the forest around her began to change. The golden leaves faded into a vibrant green, the trees stretching skyward like ancient sentinels. Birds chirped softly, their melodies weaving into the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. The path beneath her feet transformed from glowing light to solid earth, warm and firm with each step. Clara paused, taking in the serenity of the moment. She had almost forgotten what peace felt like. The trials, the fear, the loss, it all seemed so far away now, like a distant storm that had finally passed. She touched her chest, where she could still feel the faint warmth of the orb she had released. It was gone now, but its impact lingered. You made it. The voice startled her, and she turned sharply to see a figure standing at the edge of the path. It was Ethan. Clara's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she thought it was another illusion, another trick meant to test her resolve. But as she looked closer, she saw the softness in his expression, the familiar kindness in his eyes. Ethan, she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded. Stepping closer, he looked just as he had before, whole, at peace, and entirely real. But how? She asked, her voice breaking. I thought you were gone. Ethan smiled gently, his presence as warm as the golden light around them. I never really left, he said, not in the way you thought. I was always a part of you, Clara, just like the guilt, the fear, and the pain you faced. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of sorrow. You were the one who kept me going, she said. I kept hearing your voice, even when everything was falling apart. Ethan's smile deepened. And you listened. You fought through it all. You found your strength. Clara took a step closer, her hands trembling. Was it real? The motel? The trials? Everything? Was it all real? Ethan hesitated, his gaze thoughtful. Reality is what we make of it, he said. Room 13 wasn't just a place, it was a reflection of what was inside you. The fear you've carried, the regrets you couldn't let go of, it brought you there to face them. Clara frowned, her thoughts racing. But why me? Why now? Because you were ready, Ethan replied. Ready to stop running, ready to face the truth. Clara looked down, her tears falling freely now. I didn't save you. I let you go. You saved yourself, Ethan said, his voice gentle. And that's what matters. You didn't let go of me, you let go of the guilt, the weight that was holding you back. That's how you find freedom. Clara's chest tightened, her emotions a whirlwind. She wanted to say so much, but the words escaped her. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing against Ethan's. The touch was warm, familiar, grounding her in the moment. Will I see you again? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's smile was bittersweet. I'm always with you, Clara. In every step you take, in every choice you make, I'll be there. But it's time for you to move forward. Clara nodded, her heart aching but filled with a quiet determination. I'll keep fighting, she promised. For me. For you. Ethan stepped back, his form beginning to fade into the golden light. And I'll always be proud of you, he said. Goodbye, Clara. Goodbye, she whispered, her tears glistening in the sunlight. Ethan disappeared, his presence dissolving into the warmth of the forest. Clara stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. The ache of loss remained, but it was no longer overwhelming. It was a part of her, a reminder of what she had endured and the strength she had found. She turned back to the path, her steps steady and purposeful. The light ahead grew brighter, the horizon opening into a vast expanse of possibilities. The future was unknown, but for the first time in her life, Clara felt ready to face it. As she walked forward, the forest faded, and the golden light enveloped her completely. The past was behind her, the trials conquered, and room 13 was no more. All that remained was the journey ahead. As Clara stepped through the golden light, she emerged into a world unlike anything she had seen before. It wasn't the familiar forest, nor the oppressive shadows of room 13. It was a vast, open field under a sky that seemed to stretch infinitely. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers, and the grass beneath her feet was soft, vibrant, and alive. The horizon was painted with hues of gold and amber, as though the sun was caught in an eternal dawn. Clara paused, breathing deeply, letting the serenity of this new place fill her. It felt like stepping into a dream, a place untouched by fear, pain, or regret. Ahead of her, the path continued, winding gently through the field. But this time, she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She knew she had faced the worst and come out stronger. Whatever awaited her now was part of a future she was ready to embrace. As she walked, the faint sound of laughter reached her ears. It was soft at first, distant, but it grew louder with every step. Clara's heart raced, her mind searching for the source. The laughter wasn't just any laughter, it was familiar. Turning a corner in the path, she froze. There, standing in the middle of the field, were figures she recognized immediately. Her mother, her father, and Ethan, all smiling, their faces warm and inviting. Behind them, other familiar faces appeared, friends she had lost, people she had once loved, all standing together in the golden light. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she approached. Her mother stepped forward first, her face free of the sternness Clara had remembered. Instead, her eyes were filled with kindness. "You've come so far," her mother said, her voice soft. "We've been waiting for you." Clara's voice trembled. "I thought I'd never see you again. I thought I lost you." Her mother shook her head gently. "You never lost us, Clara. We've always been with you, even when you couldn't see us. And we're so proud of the person you've become." Her father stepped forward next, his expression calm and steady. "You faced more than most could bear, and yet, you kept moving. You found your strength." Clara turned to Ethan, her heart aching as she saw his familiar smile. He didn't speak, but his eyes held everything she needed to hear. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and embraced him, the warmth of his presence grounding her in the moment. "I don't understand," Clara said, pulling back slightly. "Is this real? Am I dead?" Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "This place isn't life or death, Clara. It's a crossroads. A place where your journey reaches a turning point." Clara frowned, her thoughts racing. "A turning point? What does that mean? What happens now?" Ethan stepped closer, his voice calm and steady. "It means the choice is yours, Clara. You faced the darkness, confronted your fears, and let go of the pain that held you back. Now, you have the chance to decide whether to stay here, with us, or to return." Clara's breath caught. "Return? To what?" "To your life," her father said gently. "A life where you can truly live, free of the shadows that haunted you." Clara looked around at the golden field, at the faces of the people she loved. For the first time in years, she felt whole, complete, as though every wound had finally healed. The thought of leaving this place, of leaving them, filled her with an almost unbearable sadness. "But if I stay," she began, her voice breaking. "If you stay, you'll be at peace," her mother said. "But if you return, you'll have the chance to live fully, to carry the strength you found into the world and make it brighter." Clara's chest tightened. The choice felt impossible. She looked at Ethan, searching his eyes for guidance. "You've already made hard choices," Ethan said, his voice soft. "But this one is yours alone. Whatever you choose, it's the right choice." Clara closed her eyes, her mind swirling with memories of her journey. She thought of the trials she had faced, the shadows she had overcome, and the promise she had made to Ethan. She thought of the future, the unknown path that stretched beyond room 13. And as the warmth of the golden light filled her, she realized the truth. She had spent so long running, hiding from the pain of her past. But now, she was ready to step forward, to truly live. Clara opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I love you all," she said, her voice trembling. "But I need to go back. I need to live." Her mother smiled, her eyes shimmering with pride. "Then go, Clara, and know that we'll always be with you." The field began to fade, the golden light growing brighter and brighter. Clara reached out, her hand brushing against Ethan's one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Ethan smiled. "Goodbye, Clara. Live well." The light engulfed her completely, and she felt herself being pulled forward, weightless and free. When Clara opened her eyes again, she was lying on the floor of room 13. The air was still, the walls silent, and the oppressive energy that had once filled the space was gone. She sat up slowly, her body aching but her heart steady. The door to the room was open, sunlight streaming through it. Clara stood, taking one last look at the room that had changed her life. Then, with steady steps, she walked through the door, leaving room 13 behind forever. Outside, the world was alive with light and sound. Birds chirped, the wind whispered through the trees, and the distant hum of cars reminded her of life's ordinary rhythm. Clara took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with a sense of renewal. The past was behind her, the future awaited. And for the first time, Clara felt ready to embrace it.